Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the hood on one of history's most overrated jobs. Being a medieval assassin sounds mysterious, dangerous, even glamorous. The truth? It was closer to sleeping in filth, eating mouldy bread, and constantly wondering if your boss planned to pay you, or hang you. Forget the legends of silent blades in the moonlight. The real life of a hired killer was dirty, itchy, and usually very short. Before we slip into the alleyways of medieval Europe, take a second to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy these strange little time travel disasters I put together, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, let the hum of your fan or heater fade into the background, and let's step quietly inside. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, you're also a contract killer and it's nothing like the movies. Your bed is a straw sack stuffed with bugs, and your safe house is really just a rotting tenement with walls that leak more secrets than they keep. The wool hood you pull over your face isn't mysterious. It's itchy, greasy, and crawling with lice that bite at your scalp like they're trying to speedrun your misery. You stretch, and your joints crack like twigs, even though you're barely out of your teens. Assassins didn't age gracefully. They didn't age much at all. Breakfast is a stale crust dipped in sour ale, which you choke down while rats squeak in the corner. There's no training montage, no sharpening blades to a heroic soundtrack. Just you, hoping the dagger you bought at the market won't snap in half the first time you actually use it. Out in the streets, stealth is a joke. The cobblestones squelch with animal droppings, fish guts, and yesterday's chamber pots. Every step you take sounds like you're stomping through porridge. And the smell, it's so thick it coats the back of your throat. You try to hold your breath, but that just makes you lightheaded, which isn't ideal when you're supposed to be sneaky. And here's the thing about poisons. You think you're some alchemical mastermind mixing deadly brews. In reality, you're grinding herbs, toads, and questionable powders together, praying they kill your target instead of giving them an upset stomach and leaving you holding the blame. More than a few assassins poison themselves by accident. It's less cloak and dagger, more clumsy and diarrhea. But the worst part isn't the filth, the hunger, or the lice. It's that betrayal is built into the job description. Employers didn't pay pensions, they paid executioners. You finish the job, and instead of a reward you might get a rope around your neck to make sure you never talk. In medieval Europe, your career path usually ended at the gallows, not in retirement. So as you sit in that dark alley, dagger in hand, stomach growling, and boots soaked in things you don't want to identify, you realise the legends lied. Being a medieval assassin wasn't power, or freedom, or even glory. It was just another way to suffer, with a slightly better cloak. And if you think your working conditions are bad, wait until you find out where you're expected to sleep when the night's over. And when the night's work ended, you didn't retreat to some hidden chamber with velvet drapes and candlelight. You crawled into whatever hole in the city no one else wanted. An assassin did not get the luxury of a private room, unless it was the kind with iron bars. You bedded down in tenements that sagged like collapsing loaves of bread, in barns that reeked of manure, or in corners of taverns thick with smoke and lice. Privacy was a fantasy, and comfort was treason against your spine. Your mattress was often just a sack of straw, and not the fresh kind. Records from medieval city inventories show that straw bedding was reused for months, even years. By the time you lay down, it had soaked up sweat, drool, fleas, and the occasional rat nest. Archaeologists who studied preserved medieval bedding found parasite eggs woven into the fibres, a reminder that your bed was less a place of rest and more a farm for microscopic tormentors. You thought assassins slipped into dreamless sleep with a dagger under the pillow. In reality, they stayed awake scratching, tossing, and swearing silently at vermin. Night brought other hazards. The medieval city did not sleep peacefully. Bells rang, drunkards shouted, animals fought in the streets, and the night watch clattered by with halberds and lanterns. These guards were not your friends. Cities like Paris and London had ordinances against vagrancy. Being caught asleep in an alley could mean a beating or worse, because the night watch assumed that anyone awake at midnight was either a thief or plotting to become one. As an assassin, you were both. So you curled into the shadows, hoping the smell of the fish guts you used as camouflage masked your presence. There was also the cold. Houses were drafty enough, but the outdoors? Medieval winters cut to the bone. Firewood was precious and expensive, so unless you were lucky enough to sleep near a tavern hearth, you spent the night shivering. Frostbite was not recorded as elegantly as poisonings or sword wounds, but it was real. Even chronic joint pain shows up in skeletons from medieval cemeteries, proof that people endured long, damp nights that wore their bodies down. Imagine being in your 20s and already hobbling like an old man, and then remember you still had murders to commit before breakfast. And then came the smells. Taverns smelled like a brewery that had been set on fire and extinguished with sewage. Stables smelled like horses and what came out of horses. Even private homes reeked, because the medieval idea of ventilation was an open door and hope. Soot clung to your lungs, mould grew in corners, and chamber pots overflowed. A chronic cough was practically part of the job description. Try sneaking silently when every other breath rattles like a broken bellows. The church bells marked time, but they also marked misery. At dawn you were dragged awake by their tolling, your head pounding from bad ale or no ale at all. Sleep was not restorative. It was an interval of itching, coughing, and hoping the person next to you did not stab you first. For assassins, exhaustion was constant. Chronic sleep deprivation has been linked in modern studies to poor judgment and paranoia. You did not need a scientist to tell you that being constantly tired made you sloppy, and sloppy assassins did not live long. The irony is that medieval rulers understood the importance of sleep. Monks followed strict schedules that revolved around prayer and rest. Kings built elaborate chambers for comfort and safety. Meanwhile, assassins skulked in tenements with drafty shutters and lice infestations. You were part of the dangerous underclass, always one step from being swept away in a purge. To the city, you were not a mysterious hooded figure. You were another filthy body in the night. Food and sleep were intertwined. Go to bed hungry and you dreamed of bread. Wake up starving and your first thought was not your mission, but whether you could scrounge something edible. Chronic malnutrition weakened your body and your focus. Studies of medieval skeletons show evidence of rickets, anemia, and stunted growth, the legacy of poor diets. Assassins were no exception. Every job carried the added weight of fatigue and hunger gnawing at you like rats at your boots. Sometimes you managed to rest in a noble's home if a job brought you there. But even castles were not immune to discomfort. Guard robes, the castle toilets, emptied into the moat, which doubled as a swamp of filth and disease. The smell drifted up through walls and corridors, perfuming your rest with a stench fit for no man. Even royal beds were stuffed with straw and feathers that attracted mites. Sleeping in a castle did not make you safer. It just made your nightmares smell worse. And then, of course, there was the paranoia. Lying in the dark, you were never sure if someone followed you home. Employers had a habit of silencing their own assassins. Spies and informants were everywhere. You might close your eyes, but sleep was shallow. Every creak of timber sounded like a boot. Every cough outside like the last sound you would hear. In that sense, you never really slept. You hid from consciousness the same way you hid from the law, poorly and briefly. All this meant that assassins aged quickly. Written records from trials describe men in their 20s as withered, hollow-eyed, and already grey. Exhaustion carved into their faces the way hunger carved into their ribs. The legend of the hooded killer might make for good ballads, but the reality was much closer to a life of insomnia, filth, and aching bones. And as you lie awake on that sack of straw, itchy, freezing, and wondering if you will wake up at all, you realise that the so-called glamour of your trade does not exist. Sleep is just another danger, another weakness. Assassins did not thrive in the shadows, they collapsed in them. But the misery of sleep was only part of the picture. Because even when you were awake, the tools of your trade often betrayed you in ways that made your job far deadlier than your targets. The dagger in your hand feels more like a gamble than a weapon. Medieval blades were not forged for elegance. They were churned out by blacksmiths working under smoky forges, pounding iron that was as brittle as stale bread. A dagger might bend after one strike or snap entirely if it hit bone at the wrong angle. In fact, historians studying battlefield finds often discover blades broken into pieces, the discarded fragments scattered like confetti of failure. For an assassin, this meant your carefully planned strike could end with you standing there holding half a weapon while your victim shouted for help. Daggers were technically the signature tool of assassins, but that was only because they were cheap and concealable. By the 13th century, laws in cities like London restricted blade lengths in markets, forcing killers to work with stubby knives barely longer than a kitchen utensil. Try stabbing through layers of wool, leather, or even chainmail with something the size of a butter spreader. The odds were not in your favour. Assassination was supposed to be silent and swift. Instead, it often turned into a desperate wrestling match in a back alley, more slapstick than sinister. Crossbows were another option, at least in theory. They had the advantage of distance, which sounds brilliant until you realise how clumsy they were. Medieval crossbows required winding mechanisms called windlasses or goat's foot levers. These devices took precious time to set up, time you rarely had if your target was walking briskly or surrounded by guards. The noise of the crank gave away your position long before the bolt was loosed. And let's not forget the accuracy issue. Even trained soldiers had trouble hitting moving targets at range. For an assassin trying to nail one specific noble without accidentally skewering a random fishmonger nearby, the odds were laughable. Poisons were meant to solve these problems, but medieval toxicology was closer to cooking with blindfolds on. Recipes included ground glass, arsenic, henbane, and occasionally mashed up toads, all mixed together with hopeful malice. Chroniclers describe political killings that failed spectacularly because the poison only gave the victim diarrhea or made them vomit in public. One Italian chronicler from the 15th century even wrote of a poisoning that worked on the wrong person, the assassin themselves, who had forgotten to wash their hands before eating. The line between killer and casualty blurred with every sip of suspicious wine. Weapons were also heavy. A sword, while dramatic, was impractical for assassination. Carrying one through crowded medieval streets marked you as a soldier or thug, not a shadowy figure. Many city laws banned swords in taverns or churches, which were exactly the kinds of places assassins often stalked. So unless you wanted to stand out like a medieval cosplayer at the wrong convention, you had to rely on concealed knives. Those knives were often poorly balanced and rusted quickly in damp environments. Iron corrodes easily, and medieval humidity was unforgiving. A rusty blade was dangerous to both ends, because one slip could infect you just as easily as your target. Even bows, which had revolutionized medieval warfare, were absurd for assassination. The longbow in particular required years of training and superhuman strength. Skeletons of English archers show warped spines and enlarged arm bones from constant practice. No assassin had that kind of training time, nor the muscle mass to pull a bowstring strong enough to pierce armour. If you did manage to fire a shot, it was loud, obvious, and nearly impossible to disguise as an accident. The tools of stealth were equally disappointing. Throwing knives, more fantasy than fact. Surviving medieval manuals barely mention them, and when they do, it's usually as a novelty trick rather than a practical method of killing. Blowpipes, rare, unreliable, and often more likely to make you lightheaded from blowing too hard. In reality, assassins had no gadgets, no clever mechanical tricks. They had whatever was cheap and easy to hide, which was usually also cheap and easy to break. This lack of reliable equipment forced assassins to get uncomfortably close. Killings were intimate, sweaty affairs, carried out in the press of bodies or the stink of narrow alleyways. Imagine the terror of slipping a blade beneath a rib only to feel it catch on bone, or worse, bend completely. Suddenly your victim is screaming, the guards are alerted, and you're fumbling for a backup plan that does not exist. Many assassins were beaten to death on the spot by outraged townsfolk before they ever had a chance to run. Archaeological digs of medieval crime scenes sometimes reveal half-buried weapons tossed in desperation. A snapped blade in a gutter, a bent crossbow bolt wedged between stones. These were not the tools of unstoppable killers. They were the failures of men who trusted iron more than circumstance, and circumstances in the Middle Ages were rarely in your favour. Even the simplest weapon, a club or cudgel, came with problems. They were cheap, yes, but not subtle. A skull caved in was impossible to pass off as an accident. Nobles were often surrounded by attendants, meaning the moment you swung, a dozen hands dragged you down. The medieval urban crowd was not forgiving. Public beatings of captured assassins became spectacles, with citizens eager to stomp or spit on someone who dared to disrupt their already miserable daily lives. Every weapon choice carried a risk of exposure, failure, or self-inflicted harm. Unlike the sleek daggers of movies, medieval tools were crude, inconsistent, and dangerous to handle. Your very livelihood depended on unreliable steel and questionable chemistry. One slip, one miscalculation, and the only person you managed to kill was yourself. And as you sit polishing your bent dagger, the edges chipped from last week's failed strike, you realise that your so-called arsenal is more curse than advantage. Every blade, every vial, every clumsy crossbow bolt is a reminder that the Middle Ages did not make life easy for the assassin. But tools were only half the battle. The other half was the city itself, a place so loud, filthy and chaotic that slipping through unseen was less artful stealth and more desperate improvisation. The city is not your ally. To be invisible in medieval Europe, you would have needed silence, shadows, and anonymity. What you actually had were clattering cobblestones, gossiping neighbours, and the overwhelming soundtrack of donkeys braying at 2 a.m. Streets were designed for chaos, not discretion. Narrow lanes twisted like drunken mazes, hemmed in by leaning timber houses that threatened to fall on you at any moment. The ground underfoot was slick with animal waste, fish guts, and whatever the residents had flung out their windows that day. Moving quietly meant slipping constantly, which is less mysterious and more humiliating. Most medieval towns were not even paved until late in the Middle Ages. Dirt streets turned to mud after rain, and mud preserved footprints like accusations written into the ground. Archaeologists excavating York discovered layers of compacted mud mixed with straw, dung and refuse, showing just how sticky and filthy the surfaces were. An assassin could leave behind a perfect trail without realizing it, each boot print glowing like a neon sign to anyone paying attention. Stealth was supposed to be your greatest asset. Instead, the city itself betrayed you. Noise was another obstacle. Unlike modern cities with streetlights and traffic hum, medieval cities were loud in different ways. Night watchmen patrolled with bells and lanterns. Blacksmiths hammered late into the evening. Dogs barked constantly, guarding every doorway. A single creak of a leather boot could vanish into this cacophony, but it could also stand out precisely because it was unfamiliar. Anyone awake in the dark was suspicious, and suspicion often turned into mobs. Citizens were encouraged to police themselves, with bylaws in places like Paris making it mandatory to call out strangers after dark. You were never truly unseen, because someone was always listening. Then there was the smell. Medieval chroniclers wrote about the stench of cities so foul that it overwhelmed travellers from rural areas. Streets doubled as open sewers. The waste of households, animals and workshops flowed directly underfoot. In London, so much waste poured into the Thames that royal decrees tried and failed to curb it. For an assassin, this was both camouflage and curse. The smell clung to your clothes, marking you as someone who'd been skulking near drains or gutters. Try mingling with nobles while reeking like a privy. Disguise only worked if people could stand being near you. Cities also lit themselves poorly. Oil lamps and torches were expensive, so most streets were illuminated only by moonlight. This gave you shadows to hide in, but it also meant you were stumbling blind. falling into a cesspit or tripping over a loose stone was a constant risk. The danger was not glamorous, it was practical. Break an ankle in the dark and your career ended in a heap of pain before you ever reached your target. Even monasteries, with their regulated hours and careful routines, were poorly lit. Monks complained about stumbling during nightly prayers. If holy men could not walk silently, what chance did you have sneaking through alleys with murder on your mind? And the geography of cities was working against you. Urban planning was almost non-existent. Houses were crammed together, with upper stories jutting out so far they nearly touched across the street. This created overhangs that trapped smoke and smells while funneling sound. Every cough echoed, every whisper travelled. Markets were dense with stalls, each one packed with tools, fabrics or barrels that could be knocked over. The image of slipping unseen through a crowded square was fantasy. Reality was bumping into a crate of onions, scattering them across cobblestones, and praying no one noticed the hooded figure fleeing from flying produce. Rivers and bridges were no easier. Waterways cut through cities like arteries, but most bridges were lined with shops. Passing across one meant weaving through merchants, apprentices, and gossips. Surveillance was unintentional but constant. Neighbours knew who belonged on their street. A stranger passing repeatedly raised questions, and questions were dangerous. In many towns, curfews were enforced by bells, after which loiterers could be arrested on sight. You had little time to make your moves before every door bolted shut and every watchman sharpened his suspicion. Disguise was one solution, but it rarely worked. Clothing was not mass-produced. Each region and trade had its own patterns, colours and fabrics. A tailor's apprentice dressed differently from a sailor, who dressed differently from a monk. Step into the wrong neighbourhood wearing the wrong shoes and you stood out immediately. Historians studying medieval textiles note that fabrics were highly localised. Wool from one region looked different from wool in another. To blend in, you needed not just clothes but the right accent, posture and dirt distribution. Any slip could mark you as an outsider, and outsiders were rarely trusted. Even rooftops, the supposed playground of assassins in later fiction, were ridiculous. Thatch and wooden shingles were fragile. Climbing onto them often resulted in broken tiles or worse, a plunge into someone's smoky living room. Roofs were steep, slippery and unsteady. Chimneys belched soot directly into your face, and if you were spotted you were not feared but laughed at. Records described thieves caught on rooftops being mocked by crowds below before being dragged down for punishment. There was no silent silhouette against the moon. There was only you, coughing soot, sliding toward a painful landing. To make matters worse, medieval cities were filled with animals. Pigs roamed freely, rooting in waste. Chickens fluttered noisily at the slightest disturbance. Horses clopped down streets at unpredictable hours. Even cats, prized for controlling rats, could betray your presence by yowling at the wrong moment. Imagine creeping silently, only for a pig to squeal loudly and send the entire block peering out their shutters. The city was a living alarm system, and none of it worked in your favour. This environment shaped the very reputation of assassins. They were not shadows gliding unseen. They were blunders wrapped in cloaks, stumbling through muck, praying the noise of the city covered their failures. Chroniclers mention attempts at assassination gone wrong not because of bravery or loyalty, but because the killer slipped, shouted, or was spotted in a crowd that recognised them. Cities recorded deaths in gruesome detail, but failed assassinations were remembered with ridicule. Infamy was far more common than success, and as you inch through the night, boots slick, cloak heavy with stink, and ears filled with the racket of animals and watchmen, you realise the streets are not a backdrop to your profession. They are the enemy. Every sound, every smell, every uneven stone is a betrayal. The city itself works harder to kill you than any sword ever could. But even if you survived the city, your troubles were not over. Because once you reached your mark, you still had to deal with the body, and nothing about medieval murder disposal was simple. Killing someone in the Middle Ages was the easy part. What came after was the true nightmare. A body did not simply vanish into the shadows. Cities were tight, cramped, and filled with people who noticed everything. Hiding a corpse in medieval Europe was like trying to sneak a bonfire into a broom closet. Even if you managed the act itself with precision, the logistics afterward turned every assassin into a reluctant janitor. Blood was the first betrayal. In an era before forensic science, it might seem like you could get away with murder scot-free, but medieval observers were disturbingly sharp when it came to stains. Cloth and stone both held blood like a permanent signature. Contemporary manuals for household management included recipes for removing blood from linens, usually with vinegar, ashes, or urine. That should tell you two things. First, people noticed blood enough to care about cleaning it. Second, if you were caught scrubbing with a bucket of urine in the middle of the night, suspicions were going to rise quickly. Dragging a body posed new challenges. Streets were narrow, uneven, and packed with obstacles. Archaeological evidence from towns like Lübeck and York shows thoroughfares sometimes barely 3 feet wide. Picture trying to drag a full-grown man through those channels without waking half the neighbourhood. Even wrapping the body in cloth did little to disguise the shape. People knew what a human form looked like. You could not pretend it was a sack of grain when 2 hands and a head were clearly poking through. Waterways were the classic dumping ground. Rivers like the Thames or the Seine carried away countless crimes, their currents swallowing bodies before the city could ask questions. But water was not a guarantee of secrecy. Corpses floated. Chroniclers repeatedly mentioned strange bodies washing up near bridges, where citizens gawked before officials dragged them ashore. Drowning did not disguise stabbing wounds. In some cases, rivers even highlighted them, bloating corpses into grotesque balloons that drew more attention than if you had left the victim in an alley. Wells were another hiding place, though a deeply unpopular one, not because they were hard to access, but because they poisoned the water supply. In 14th century France, records survive of assassins executed not for the killing itself, but for fouling a communal well with their disposal efforts. Nothing made a community angrier than having its only water source ruined by the smell of decomposition. If your goal was secrecy, dumping a body where it made everyone sick was not the best plan. There were also religious consequences. In a deeply Christian society, how and where a body was found carried heavy meaning. Burial in consecrated ground was essential for salvation. Leaving a corpse unburied was considered an insult to both the victim and God. Public suspicion fell immediately on anyone connected to such a crime, and rumours spread faster than plague. Chronicles are filled with towns where an unexplained body became the spark for witch trials, scapegoating, or political purges. For an assassin, this meant your handiwork might not be hidden at all, but magnified into a moral panic that swept you up in its fury. And even when the body was hidden, there was the problem of smell. Decomposition in a medieval city was noticeable within hours. Without refrigeration, corpses swelled, discoloured, and emitted gases that seeped through cracks and walls. In summer, this process accelerated alarmingly. Anyone walking past a suspiciously foul-smelling cellar or barn could quickly guess what was inside. Medieval people may not have known the science of bacteria, but they understood rot. The stench of death was unmistakable, and neighbours did not keep quiet about it. Disposal was so problematic that some assassins avoided it entirely. Instead, they staged killings to look like accidents or street brawls. The problem was that medieval accidents were often investigated. City laws in Bologna and London required officials to inspect sudden deaths, recording wounds and causes. These were not modern detectives with fingerprints and microscopes, but they could tell a stabbing from a stumble. Even juries of local citizens called to examine corpses noted details like knife wounds, broken bones, or missing purses. Your attempt at disguise could collapse under the combined scrutiny of neighbours eager to gossip. Then came the haunting prospect of divine detection. Superstitions abounded that corpses could reveal their killers. Folklore across Europe described the beer rite, where a body would bleed in the presence of its murderer. Courts occasionally even used this belief as evidence, forcing suspects to touch a corpse to see if it reacted. Imagine being dragged before a crowd, told to lay your hand on the very body you left behind, while everyone waited to see if it bled anew. Even if it did not, the spectacle alone was enough to brand you guilty in the public eye. Cleanup was no easier. There were no disinfectants, no gloves, no bleach. Assassins wiped weapons on tunics or cloaks, which left stains for others to notice. Clothing was expensive, often only 1 or 2 outfits per person. A blood-stained sleeve could not simply be thrown away. Laundry involved boiling water, ash, and laborious scrubbing. Washing away murder was not just difficult, it was practically impossible without drawing more attention to yourself. This is why so many assassinations took place in crowded areas. Not because the killers wanted witnesses, but because the chaos provided cover. Markets, processions, and religious gatherings offered noise and confusion to mask the deed. The problem was that confusion also created collateral damage. Innocents were struck, panics erupted, and authorities cracked down. Far from a clean surgical strike, the typical medieval assassination resembled a public disaster, with the assassin often trampled or torn apart by angry mobs before any escape could be attempted. And if you did manage to escape, there was still the issue of reputation. Murders were remembered, town chronicles noted them, ballads spread them. You could not simply vanish in a medieval community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Even travelling elsewhere carried risks. Inns required introductions or referrals, and strangers without stories raised eyebrows. Unless you carried papers or could convincingly pass as a pilgrim, your movements were restricted. A single whisper about a killing could follow you across borders, especially since the church loved nothing more than condemning sinners from the pulpit. All of this meant that assassins lived in constant fear not only of their targets, but of what came after. Killing was not the climax of your work. It was the beginning of a chain reaction of noise, smell, suspicion, and superstition that spread outward like ripples in a foul pond. You were not just fighting one man. You were fighting the city itself, its laws, its neighbours, and even its corpses. And as you picture yourself crouched over the body of your victim, sweat dripping, heart racing, wondering where you could possibly stash this very inconvenient evidence, you realise that death itself was not the most terrifying part of your work. It was the mess left behind. But corpses were only one problem. The other problem was that the very people who hired you were often far more dangerous than the targets they asked you to kill. Payment was never guaranteed. In fact, one of the most consistent risks of being a medieval assassin was that your employer considered you expendable the moment the job was done. Kings, bishops, merchants, and feuding nobles were happy to hire killers, but they were just as eager to erase evidence afterward. And nothing erased evidence quite like erasing the assassin. Written records show how dangerous this relationship could be. In Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, political killings were frequent, but those who carried them out rarely lived to enjoy their earnings. Chroniclers describe assassins being strangled or poisoned by the very households that employed them, usually within days of finishing their work. Payment, if it came at all, often arrived in the form of a dagger in the back. An assassin was a liability, a loose end waiting to expose secrets. Employers saw killing you as the final step in the plan. Money was another betrayal. Coins were heavy and often debased, mixed with lower metals to stretch value. When you were paid, it was frequently in clipped silver pennies or worn-out florins, worth less than promised. Worse, sometimes the payment was not in coins at all, but in vague promises of protection, or land that never materialized. Imagine risking your life to plunge a dagger into a bishop's rival, only to receive a scrap of paper with a wax seal as compensation, redeemable at a date your employer never intended to honour. The church made things even more dangerous. Hiring assassins was technically sinful, and yet bishops and abbots were known to quietly employ killers when disputes grew too heated. When these jobs were exposed, the clergy simply declared the assassin a rogue criminal acting alone. Employers walked away unscathed while you, the disposable blade, bore the punishment. Inquisition records sometimes mention shadowy figures who committed violence for churchmen, only to vanish from history once they outlived their usefulness. Their erasure was deliberate. Assassins were meant to be forgotten, not rewarded. And then there were noble families. Dynastic politics in places like Milan or Naples turned into bloody chess games. Hiring an assassin was cheaper than raising an army, but family loyalty was fickle. A count or duke might pay you to kill his cousin, then, fearing you could blackmail him later, arrange for your disappearance. In a world where poisoning was as common as bribery, assassins were constantly testing their wine with paranoid sips, knowing full well their own employer's kitchen boy could be the instrument of their downfall. Betrayal was not always violent. Sometimes it was legal. Employers had the influence to declare you an outlaw, shifting all blame for a killing onto you while they claimed ignorance. Being declared an outlaw was essentially a death sentence. It meant no legal protection, no safe haven, and no rights. Anyone could rob, beat, or kill you without consequence. Medieval legal documents are filled with outlaws condemned not for their crimes, but for being useful scapegoats in political intrigues. Once labelled an outlaw, you were fair game for everyone from guards to peasants, who might attack you for the chance to claim a reward. Even when an assassin survived betrayal, trust was non-existent. Payment often came through middlemen, shadowy go-betweens who disappeared the moment coin changed hands. These intermediaries ensured the employer's name never surfaced. If the assassin was caught, no trail led back to the powerful patron. This left you alone, dangling in the wind, an expendable tool without allies. Your very survival depended on trusting people whose entire business model was betrayal. The paranoia shaped how assassins lived. They avoided showing their faces, refused to drink in public, and slept in shifting locations. Some even turned to mercenary companies or criminal gangs for protection, hoping that strength in numbers would keep employers honest. But gangs had their own rules, and betrayal within those circles was just as common. A rival assassin could be bribed to eliminate you for half your promised wage. Murder for hire became a cycle of killers killing killers, a grim pyramid scheme with no winners. Documents from the 15th century show just how ruthless this world was. In Milan, the infamous Visconti family used assassins liberally to settle scores, but the killers themselves rarely lasted long enough to enjoy their wages. Chroniclers describe assassins hanged as thieves, drowned in rivers, or mysteriously disappeared after jobs. It was not incompetence that doomed them, but calculated betrayal. A powerful employer had no reason to leave behind a witness to his schemes. Eliminating the assassin was as essential as eliminating the target. This constant danger meant assassins were trapped in a cycle of mistrust. To survive, they sometimes switched sides, offering information about their employers to rivals in exchange for protection. But this only made them more despised. Double-crossing was seen as dishonourable even in a world built on treachery. When caught, these assassins faced tortures designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, ensuring no one would ever trust their kind again. And it was not just political elites who betrayed them. Ordinary employers were just as treacherous. Wealthy merchants who hired killers to silence competitors often found it cheaper to report the assassin afterward, earning praise for helping rid the city of crime. Guilds too used assassins during disputes, only to denounce them once the conflict ended. The assassin became both weapon and scapegoat, a tool everyone despised once it had been used. The irony is that betrayal became one of the defining features of the assassin's life. You lived by the blade, but you were more likely to die by betrayal. The danger was not only your target, but the very hand that paid you. Success did not bring stability. It brought the certainty that someone was already plotting your end. And as you count your coins in a smoky tavern corner, feeling the weight of eyes on you and the faint taste of bitterness in your wine, you realise that your real enemy is not the man you stabbed in the alley. It is the man who hired you, sitting comfortably in a hall somewhere, already planning to erase you from existence. But betrayal from employers was not the only threat. The law itself had creative and horrifying punishments reserved for hired killers, punishments designed not just to execute you, but to make you an unforgettable lesson to everyone else. The law had no patience for hired killers. Getting caught meant you were not just going to die, you were going to die in a way that made every townsman, child and goat remember your face for years. Medieval punishments were not subtle. They were public, theatrical, and designed to scare everyone else into obedience. An assassin, being the embodiment of treachery, was treated with special creativity. Hanging was the most common, but rarely the clean, quick kind you might imagine. In England and France, hired killers were often hanged slowly, hoisted just high enough for the crowd to watch them kick and choke. Sometimes executioners added extra flair, like leaving the body to rot in the noose for weeks. Londoners walking across London Bridge in the 14th century would have seen the decaying remains of criminals dangling above the Thames, a gruesome reminder that the city did not tolerate secret blades. Assassins were not buried quietly. They were displayed like grotesque warning signs. Other punishments were tailored for shock value. Beheading was reserved for nobles, but assassins could expect something far worse. In Germanic territories, quartering was a favourite. A body was tied to 4 horses and pulled apart in the marketplace. Chroniclers describe onlookers cheering as limbs were flung into the crowd. It was brutal, but it was also entertainment. People came from miles away to watch. Executions were medieval theatre, with the assassin cast as the villain everyone loved to see destroyed. Burning was another fate. While more often associated with heresy, assassins accused of poisoning frequently found themselves on pyres. Poison was considered especially cowardly, and cowardice deserved fire. The flames were both punishment and purification. The smell of burning flesh wafted through the streets as citizens whispered about divine justice. Records from Italian city-states show poisoners and assassins burned side by side, their screams considered necessary for the moral health of the community. Torture usually came first. Confessions were prized, not just for justice but for spectacle. The rack, the strappado, the boot. All of these were employed to wring names out of the accused. Authorities wanted to know who had ordered the killing, but even if the assassin refused to talk, the torture itself was considered part of the entertainment. Crowds gathered not only for executions but for the public torment leading up to them. In some towns, torture chambers were open air, deliberately staged to make examples of criminals. You were not just punished, you were paraded. And if you were unlucky enough to be caught in France under the rule of certain monarchs, you might be broken on the wheel. This meant being tied to a large wooden wheel and bludgeoned until your bones shattered. The wheel was then hoisted up so that everyone could see you splayed out like a grotesque starfish. Executioners sometimes positioned the wheel at city gates, where travellers entering the town were greeted by the sight of your mangled body. Nothing whispered subtlety about the dangers of assassination. Everything shouted it. Medieval law codes confirm how targeted these punishments were. The Saxon Spiegel, a 13th century German legal code, explicitly described harsher sentences for crimes of betrayal than for open violence. Killing in battle was one thing, killing in secret was another. Secrecy was seen as unmanly, dishonourable, and deserving of the worst possible fate. Chroniclers use words like coward and snake to describe assassins. Punishments reflected that disdain. Execution also carried social consequences. Families of assassins often lost property, their homes seized or destroyed. In some regions, relatives were branded with infamy, forbidden from holding office or entering guilds. Being related to an assassin was enough to ruin your standing. Punishment extended beyond death, poisoning reputations for generations. This made the job even less attractive, since failure did not just destroy you but everyone connected to you. Crowds loved it. Entertainment was scarce, and execution days drew thousands. Food stalls sold bread and ale while musicians played. Chroniclers described children perched on shoulders to watch better, vendors shouting prices as bodies burned. The suffering of assassins was not just a lesson, it was a holiday. Even those who despised bloodshed showed up. Public cruelty was one of the few events everyone could attend for free. The irony is that these punishments did not stop assassination, they only made it more infamous. For every killer torn apart in a square, another was plotting in a tavern. But the memory of those punishments lingered. Skeletons unearthed from execution sites show bones shattered, skulls caved in, and evidence of burning. Archaeology confirms what chronicles bragged about. Assassins died spectacularly. Their bodies transformed into civic billboards of fear, and as you imagine yourself tied to a cart, dragged through the cobblestone streets while people jeer, spitting and hurling turnips, you realise the law was not content with simply ending your life. It needed to turn your death into a civic festival. You were not just executed, you were made into a performance. But the cruelty of execution was only one form of danger. Long before you ever reached the scaffold, you faced the constant suspicion of betrayal from ordinary citizens, whose gossip and accusations could doom you faster than any blade. The medieval assassin did not just fear blades, prisons, or fire. The deadliest weapon in a city was the human mouth. Gossip travelled faster than any dagger, and in a world without newspapers or police reports, rumour was the primary news service. One neighbour whispering could unravel an entire career of careful secrecy. Communities were tight, and anonymity was rare. Towns were compact. Families shared walls, and everyone noticed who came and went. Historians studying manorial court records in England find entire cases built on gossip. Witnesses reported strangers lurking, hooded men at odd hours, or suspicious noises at night. These phrases were vague, but they were enough to start legal action. Once suspicion stuck, it was almost impossible to shake. Markets were rumour factories. A medieval market was not just a place to buy bread. It was where people exchanged news about sickness, births, and murders. Merchants shouted, gossip spread, and reputations were dissected while eels and cabbages changed hands. If someone spotted you near a victim's home, the story warped into he was there to kill before the day ended. Rumour inflated details, turning chance sightings into accusations, and medieval courts often took gossip seriously. If enough neighbours swore they saw you, the law did not demand much more proof. Superstition made things worse. People believed evil left a mark. Being pale, scratching your neck too often, or even walking quickly in shadows could brand you suspicious. Chroniclers describe communities convinced that killers could be identified by their eyes, which supposedly darted too nervously. Medieval sermons warned congregations to watch for sinners in their midst. A man wearing a hood indoors was immediately suspect, and assassins lived in hoods. Your disguise was essentially an advertisement that you had something to hide. Taverns were deadly for the assassin not because of swords, but because of loose tongues. Alcohol loosened secrets, and customers listened. Stories about who had money, who had enemies, and who had vanished recently were traded between gulps of ale. The assassin sitting silently in the corner was not ignored. He was the topic of conversation. Even if no one suspected you outright, they noticed your silence, your refusal to drink, or the strange stains on your cloak. By morning, 3 different stories about your business were circulating, none of which you had told. And then there were neighbours. Medieval housing was crowded with shared walls, courtyards, and communal wells. Privacy did not exist. Everyone heard your footsteps. Everyone smelled your cooking. If you came home late or refused to explain where you had been, speculation bloomed. Manorial rolls are filled with testimony from neighbours accusing one another of theft, adultery, or witchcraft. In such an environment, the assassin had no hope of blending in. One whispered accusation, repeated enough, created a truth the law accepted. Foreigners suffered the worst. Medieval cities distrusted outsiders, especially those with unfamiliar clothing or accents. Being from another town was often enough to earn suspicion. City charters in places like Paris restricted the rights of outsiders, treating them as potential criminals unless vouched for by locals. If an assassination occurred, the foreigner in the neighbourhood was the easiest scapegoat. You did not even need to be guilty. You only needed to be unfamiliar. Rumours also travelled through religious channels. Priests heard confessions, but they also preached sermons laced with warnings. A vague mention of sinners hiding in the community set minds racing, and people began connecting dots that had no business being connected. Assassins lived in constant fear that their actions, whispered in confidence, would become a parable in the Sunday sermon, with the entire town staring suspiciously at the one man who left early that morning. Worse, medieval Europe loved spectacle, and gossip thrived on it. A suspicious death drew crowds. A body found in the street sparked weeks of debate. Everyone became an amateur detective. Who was seen near the house? Who left town suddenly? Who had bought a new cloak suspiciously quickly? Theories spread, and names were suggested, often with no evidence beyond jealousy or dislike. Trials by rumour became common, and assassins were the easiest suspects. The legal system reinforced this danger. Medieval courts used something called compurgation, where multiple people swore an oath that someone was guilty. It did not matter if they had real evidence. If enough neighbours swore against you, you were condemned. Trial by ordeal sometimes followed, forcing suspects to plunge hands into boiling water or walk across hot irons to prove innocence. No assassin walked away from these trials clean. Even survival branded you with scars that marked you forever. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons reveal evidence of community justice too. Some bodies show signs of multiple blunt force injuries, the hallmark of mob violence rather than formal execution. This suggests assassins and suspected killers were sometimes beaten to death by angry citizens before the law could even act. Rumour did not just condemn, it killed. The irony is that gossip could spread faster than your blade ever could. You might eliminate a target in seconds, but by dawn the entire town was buzzing about a stranger in a hood, a man with a scar, or someone who smelled like smoke and vinegar. By the time you reached the city gates, guards already knew who to look for. And as you imagine yourself slinking down an alley, overhearing neighbours mutter about the hooded figure while they dump chamber pots into the gutter, you realise gossip is as fatal as any sword. You do not need to be caught in the act, you only need to be caught in a story. But gossip was not the only invisible enemy. The church had its own arsenal of superstitions, rituals, and divine curses that made assassination even more terrifying, turning your work into a battle not just against men, but against heaven itself. The church was not just a backdrop to medieval life. It was the referee, the lawgiver, and the terrifying voice promising eternal misery for anyone who strayed. For an assassin, this meant your crimes were not confined to earth. They followed you into eternity. Every blade you drew, every poison you stirred, carried not only the risk of capture, but the threat of divine judgment. Clerics preached constantly about the fate of sinners. Murderers were condemned in sermons as destined for hellfire, their souls dragged by demons the moment their bodies hit the ground. Stained glass windows in cathedrals showed the damned writhing in flames, pulled apart by horned monsters. These images were not subtle. They were designed to keep everyone awake at night, even those whose job required killing. You could dodge a city guard, but you could not dodge St. Peter at the pearly gates when he flipped open his ledger and saw murder for hire scribbled in red ink. Excommunication made things even worse. Being excommunicated meant you were cut off from sacraments, Christian burial, and salvation itself. It turned you into a spiritual leper. Records show that political assassins often faced excommunication even before trial, the church eager to make examples. Without absolution, you were believed to wander as a restless soul, condemned to haunt the very streets you once prowled. In a society obsessed with the afterlife, this punishment was more frightening than execution. You could survive torture, but you could not survive damnation. Medieval Europe was soaked in superstition. People believed in divine signs exposing guilt. A sudden thunderclap during Mass, a candle snuffing out, even a dog howling at night could be interpreted as proof of your sin. Folklore warned that murderers glowed faintly in the dark or cast distorted shadows. These beliefs gave communities ammunition to point fingers at anyone behaving oddly. An assassin slipping through alleys risked not just being seen, but being mythologized as a walking omen. Trial by ordeal brought religion into the courtroom. Suspected assassins were forced to plunge hands into boiling water or grasp red-hot iron to prove innocence. If the wound healed cleanly, God had intervened. If it festered, guilt was confirmed. No assassin trusted this system. Infection was inevitable. Archaeological evidence from cemeteries shows amputated fingers and severe burns on those subjected to these trials. The ordeal did not reveal truth. It revealed just how long you could scream while a priest nodded solemnly and declared the results divinely ordained. Sanctuary laws were another cruel twist. In theory, criminals could flee into a church and claim protection. In practice, sanctuary was temporary. You might be spared immediate execution, but you were confined within church grounds, often chained to a pillar or locked in a side room. Food was meagre, water scarce, and the constant presence of priests ensured your guilt was rubbed into your ears daily. Some sanctuary seekers remained for months, essentially living as prisoners of the altar. For an assassin, sanctuary meant trading one executioner for another, slowly wasting away under divine custody. Theology made even corpses dangerous. It was believed that bodies of murder victims could call out for justice. The so-called cruentation ritual forced suspects to touch the corpse. If blood flowed anew, the killer was revealed. Courts in Germany and Eastern Europe used this practice well into the 16th century. Imagine being dragged before a crowd, ordered to place your hand on a decomposing body, while everyone gasped at every trickle of fluid. Whether science or superstition, the result was the same. Suspicion hardened into guilt, and you marched from the churchyard straight to the scaffold. Monks and chroniclers delighted in recording divine retribution against assassins. Tales survive of killers struck down by sudden illness, trampled by horses, or even choked by their own cloaks. These stories spread quickly, reinforcing the idea that God himself hunted assassins. Even natural death did not spare you. Medieval art shows demons dragging souls by their hair into pits of fire, with special attention paid to those guilty of treachery. To audiences of the time, this was less metaphor and more instruction manual for what awaited anyone foolish enough to follow your path. The assassin's worst nightmare was confession. If captured, priests demanded you confess sins before death. But confession meant admitting guilt, which not only condemned you in earthly law, but also erased any chance of escaping punishment. Refusing confession left you branded unrepentant, the lowest category of sinner. Either way, you were doomed. Your last words were not heroic speeches. They were prayers muttered under the eyes of priests who had already decided your eternal fate. Even burial carried religious terror. Murderers denied absolution were often buried outside consecrated ground, tossed into ditches with thieves and heretics. Archaeologists in England and Italy have uncovered mass graves containing those exiled from the churchyard. Bodies show signs of rushed, careless burial, sometimes face down as if to humiliate them in death. Families of assassins carried the shame, knowing their relative's soul wandered purgatory forever. In a society where eternity mattered more than life itself, this was the ultimate punishment. The paranoia ran deep. Assassins were not just criminals. They were seen as agents of Satan, spreading chaos through Christendom. Every killing was painted as a war against God's order. Theologians described secret murder as a sin that cried out for vengeance, a stain so deep it poisoned the community. People believed that allowing assassins to live invited famine, plague, or divine wrath. Villages could turn violently against a suspect, not simply out of fear of crime, but out of fear of a heavenly punishment. And so every alleyway carried more than shadows. It carried sermons, superstition, and the weight of eternity pressing on your shoulders. Assassins lived not just in fear of men, but in fear of God. Their knives were not just weapons, they were tickets to damnation stamped with every silent kill. And as you picture yourself kneeling in a church, iron shackles biting your wrists, priests chanting psalms over your head, while the townspeople watch for divine signs, you realise the most terrifying part of the job was not the blade, or the poison, or even the executioner. It was the thought that you had already been condemned in the eyes of heaven long before you ever struck. But religion was not the only thing warping your existence. Even when you managed to avoid priests and gallows, your own body often betrayed you. Poor diet, disease, and parasites turned assassins into sickly figures long before the law ever caught them. Your body was never your ally. Long before the city guards or the priest came for you, your own bones, guts, and blood were already staging a rebellion. Malnutrition was a fact of life in medieval Europe, and assassins lived at the bottom of that diet. Forget balanced meals or protein intake. You survived on bread, porridge, and whatever scraps you could steal or afford. Chronic hunger carved hollows under your eyes, left your skin pale, and made every mission harder. The staple food was bread, but bread itself was a hazard. Records from the 14th century reveal that bakers often adulterated flour with chalk, ground beans, or even sawdust to stretch supplies. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons show severe tooth wear caused by grit in bread from millstones. Every bite was like chewing sandpaper. For an assassin, that meant your teeth were crumbling just when you needed to look threatening. Imagine trying to deliver fear with a smile full of stubs. Protein was scarce, meat was expensive, reserved mostly for nobles and the wealthy. Fish appeared more often, but preservation was crude. Salted herring and dried cod were common, and both came with the delightful bonus of being so tough they could chip a tooth. Malnutrition left assassins short, stunted, and weak. Studies of medieval bone growth confirm that famine years left entire generations undersized. If you were a killer for hire, you probably stood barely 5.5 feet tall, with a crooked spine and aching joints before you turned 30. Parasites turned every meal into an invasion. Latrine excavations across Europe reveal staggering numbers of worm eggs, proof that nearly everyone carried intestinal parasites. Roundworm, whipworm, and tapeworm thrived in bodies that ate poorly and lived in filth. For an assassin, that meant constant stomach cramps, bloating, and fatigue. You might have been plotting a silent strike, but your own guts betrayed you with growls loud enough to echo down an alley. Disease stalked you daily. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis were rampant in crowded cities. Chronic coughs rattled through tenements. Skeletons from London cemeteries show rib lesions consistent with tuberculosis, proving how widespread it was. Imagine trying to stalk a target silently while hacking up blood into your sleeve. Smallpox scars marked many survivors, and lice spread trench fever long before trenches existed. Every scratch of your hood carried the risk of infection. Hygiene made it worse. Bathing was rare, and when it happened, it often did more harm than good. Public bathhouses, once popular, became associated with immorality and disease by the late Middle Ages. Water itself was often polluted, meaning a soak could leave you sicker than before. Assassins did not smell mysterious. They smelled like a mixture of smoke, sweat, urine, and mould. Chronic halitosis from rotting teeth only added to the charm. Whatever fear you inspired came less from menace and more from your personal stench. Bones suffered too. Chronic arthritis appears in medieval remains far younger than modern cases. Years of crouching, climbing, and running across cobblestone shredded cartilage. Vitamin deficiencies like scurvy left gums bleeding and joints inflamed. Even the wealthiest assassins, if such a category existed, could not avoid the biological realities of their time. The body broke early. By the age of 25, you limped like someone decades older. Plague loomed over everything. The Black Death of the mid-14th century wiped out up to half of Europe's population. Cities became charnel houses, streets lined with carts hauling bodies. For assassins, plague brought both opportunity and terror. Chaos meant contracts rose, as nobles sought to eliminate rivals quickly. But plague also meant assassins themselves dropped dead in alleys before ever reaching their targets. Chroniclers describe entire bands of killers vanishing within weeks. Their services ended not by justice but by fleas. Leprosy, though rarer, carried its own stigma. Even suspected sufferers were cast out. Disfigurement marked you publicly, and any assassin unfortunate enough to develop sores or deformities was instantly unmasked. The very diseases of the Middle Ages worked as accidental law enforcement, exposing you when stealth was most needed. The worst part was that medical care offered little help. Physicians relied on the theory of humours, prescribing bloodletting, purging, or herbal concoctions of questionable merit. You might visit a barber surgeon for relief, only to lose more blood than you could spare. The irony was painful. Seeking help for fatigue might end with a leech attached to your groin, draining you further. Medicine did not cure assassins. It finished them off. Even clothing contributed to illness. Wool cloaks, when damp, stayed damp for days. This encouraged respiratory infections. Boots rotted quickly, leading to blisters that festered into ulcers. Archaeological finds of medieval shoes reveal thin leather soles worn through in weeks, useless against cobblestones slick with refuse. Every step risked infection. An assassin's daily uniform was less sleek and more suicidal, and as you picture yourself crouched in a dark street, bones aching, teeth crumbling, stomach twisting with worms, and a cough shaking your frame, you realise the body itself was an accomplice to your downfall. Assassination was not just a job of blades and shadows. It was a job of surviving long enough to wield them, a feat most never managed. But even if your body held out, the economy you lived in made survival nearly impossible. Payment was scarce. Inflation gnawed at your wages, and the very coins in your purse betrayed you as much as your bones did. The fantasy of being a medieval assassin might tempt you with images of gold coins stacked high, a hidden fortune tucked under floorboards. The reality was closer to a chipped wooden bowl, with a handful of clipped pennies rattling inside. Assassination was not a lucrative career. It was a gamble where the odds were fixed against you, and the winnings, if they ever appeared, were insultingly small. Medieval money itself was a nightmare. Coins were hand-struck, inconsistent in weight, and easily tampered with. Clipping, the practice of shaving silver off the edges of coins, was widespread. The English crown executed people for it, but the practice never stopped. By the time an assassin was paid, those silver pennies might weigh half what they were supposed to. You risked your life and received coins that jingled like tin buttons. Debased currency was rampant too. Kings frequently reduced silver content to stretch their treasuries. France's King Philip IV earned the nickname Philip the Fair, not for fairness, but for devaluing currency so often that chroniclers joked he could turn gold into copper by decree. If a king cheated his whole country, what chance did an assassin have of getting honest pay from a nervous noble? And then came inflation. The 14th century saw prices for grain and meat soar during famines. Wages for labourers barely rose to match. For an assassin, this meant your risky job paid only slightly better than ditch digging, and ditch diggers did not have to sleep with one eye open. Surviving contracts from Italy and France suggest assassins were sometimes paid sums equivalent to a few months of a craftsman's wages. Enough to tempt the desperate, but hardly the wealth of legends. When you consider the risk of execution, torture, or betrayal, it was a laughably bad deal. Employers also delayed payments or paid in kind. Instead of coins, you might receive sacks of grain, bolts of wool, or even a goat. Barter sounds quaint until you try sneaking across a city with livestock bleating in tow. Merchants were no kinder. Inns charged high fees for strangers, and money changers took hefty cuts converting foreign coins. What little you were paid evaporated quickly. Surviving records from the Hanseatic League note disputes where mercenaries and assassins demanded back pay, often in vain. Contracts were rarely enforced, and no medieval court was going to side with a professional murderer in a wage dispute. Debts piled on fast. Assassins had to bribe guards, pay for food and lodging, and sometimes fund their own weapons. Credit existed, but it was brutal. Moneylenders charged rates so high that failure to repay meant ruin. Jewish moneylenders, often the only option due to restrictions on Christian usury, were targeted by resentment, meaning your debts came with political risk as well as financial ones. If you died before repayment, your family was left responsible. Being an assassin did not just endanger your body, it endangered your household finances. Guilds excluded you. Craftsmen organised into powerful associations that regulated prices, quality and wages. Assassins belonged to no guild. That meant no protection, no collective bargaining, and no stability. A blacksmith could count on steady orders. A weaver could sell cloth at regulated prices. An assassin had no market protections, no union, and no pension. You were the medieval gig worker, paid by the task, discarded when no longer useful. Coins themselves betrayed you in other ways. Payment in large sums was suspicious. People noticed sudden wealth. Parish records, tax rolls, and inquisitive neighbours all tracked money movements. In Florence, the Catasto tax surveys of the 15th century reveal extraordinary detail about personal wealth. If an assassin suddenly appeared with new boots or a better cloak, questions followed. Wealthy patrons might protect you, but your shiny belt buckle could still mark you as guilty before the blade ever did. Inflation tied to famine was especially cruel. When the Great Famine struck in 1315, prices for rye and barley tripled in some regions. An assassin might finish a job expecting to eat well for months, only to find his wages bought little more than a loaf and a mug of ale. Chroniclers describe entire families starving while coins lost value overnight. For assassins, famine turned contracts into starvation wages, barely worth the risk of swinging from a rope. Even the physical handling of money carried danger. Medieval coins were filthy, passing through countless hands unwashed. Archaeological analysis of surviving coins shows traces of lead, copper and bacteria. Handling pay could mean poisoning yourself slowly. In an ironic twist, the very payment for murder carried toxins. Modern forensic tests on medieval skeletons confirm elevated lead levels in urban populations, much of it linked to coin circulation and pewter drinking vessels. So yes, the assassin was literally poisoned by his own wages. Bribes drained whatever remained. Guards needed paying off. Innkeepers demanded silence money. Prostitutes, servants, and porters all had to be tipped to look the other way. By the end of the night, the assassin's purse was lighter than when he started. Chroniclers note that even professional mercenaries complained of being perpetually broke, despite constant employment. Assassins with far fewer clients were worse off. Your legacy was not wealth, it was poverty with bloodstains. And so the myth of the wealthy assassin collapses under the weight of clipped coins, rotten bread, and empty purses. The truth was a profession of endless financial anxiety. Every job left you poorer in health, poorer in safety, and sometimes poorer in actual coin. And as you picture yourself sitting in a smoky tavern, counting coins so worn you cannot tell if they are real or counterfeit, while the innkeeper glares at you for unpaid ale, you realise the cruelest part of the profession was not betrayal or torture. It was that you were broke the entire time. But money was not your only problem. The disguises that were supposed to keep you safe were laughably ineffective, turning you into a walking billboard of suspicion instead of a shadow. The cloak and hood, that iconic image of the assassin, was supposed to make you invisible. In reality, it worked about as well as walking into a medieval tavern, wearing a sandwich board that read, "Up to something." Hoods were common, yes, but the moment you pulled yours low and skulked in the shadows, people noticed. In a society obsessed with watching neighbours, anything that suggested secrecy was practically a confession. Clothing was a marker of identity in the Middle Ages. Fabrics, colours, and even stitching gave away your trade, region, and social status. Peasants wore coarse, undyed wool. Merchants wore brighter hues, often dyed with madder or woad. Nobles flaunted expensive silks and velvets imported from Italy or the Levant. An assassin could not simply throw on a cloak and blend in. If your shoes looked too fine for your station, people noticed. If your cloak was patched in the wrong way, they noticed that too. Medieval city folk were experts in judging status at a glance. Disguise required not just clothing, but a convincing backstory, accent, and set of calluses to match. Even fabric betrayed you. Wool was the most common material, but it held smells like a sponge. The stench of smoke, sweat, and worse clung to you. Linen was cleaner but more expensive, meaning if you wore it while pretending to be poor, suspicions rose. Dyes told stories as well. Bright scarlet or deep blue required costly imports. Wearing those colours marked you as wealthy or connected, which made sneaking harder. A killer trying to pass as a peasant in fine blue cloth might as well have carried a sign saying wealthy imposter. Masks, the theatrical choice, were rarely used outside festivals. Wearing one in a marketplace immediately branded you suspicious. Carnival masks were acceptable only in their season, and walking through a city with a painted wooden face outside those days was like showing up to a modern office wearing scuba gear. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Assassins who tried masks discovered they concealed nothing but common sense. Hoods themselves were crawling with problems, literally. Lice infested the cloth, chewing at scalps until assassins scratched constantly. Records from medical treatises describe elaborate remedies for lice, from vinegar rinses to herbal poultices, none of which worked well. Scratching your head every 5 seconds was not stealthy. Your disguise twitched with nervous energy, making you stand out even more. Shoes were another giveaway. Medieval shoes were pointed, rounded, or strapped, depending on region and fashion. Archaeologists digging in London have found entire collections of shoes showing trends by decade. Locals could tell instantly if your footwear was out of place. An assassin from the countryside wearing the wrong style in a city would be noticed before he even reached his target. Imagine travelling hours to commit a secret murder, only to be betrayed by the length of your shoe tips. Disguising as clergy might seem clever, but it was nearly impossible. Priests and monks followed strict rules for their dress. Tonsured hair, specific robes, and the right Latin phrases were expected. Fail to mutter the right prayers and you were exposed immediately. Chroniclers note cases of impostors caught because they could not remember even the simplest psalms. Disguising as clergy did not make you holy. It made you laughable. Women's clothing presented its own traps. Garments were layered and complex, with headdresses, veils, and gowns tied in specific ways. Men attempting disguise often failed to lace gowns correctly or move with the expected gestures. In some cases, suspicion turned into public humiliation. Medieval records describe townspeople dragging out impostors who dressed as women, jeering at their failure. Assassins who tried this tactic quickly learned that society's rigid rules of dress were impossible to fake without years of practice. Even attempts at blending into rural communities failed. Village life meant everyone knew everyone. A stranger appearing in patched clothing was immediately suspect. Villagers noticed details, like whether you knew how to handle livestock, whether your hands bore the calluses of farming, or whether your cloak was patched with the wrong kind of thread. Disguise only worked if you lived it, and assassins rarely had that luxury. Archaeological evidence confirms how revealing clothing was. Textile fragments preserved in bogs and burials show a surprising variety of weaves and dyes tied to specific regions. A cloak from Scandinavia did not look like one from France. Shoes from Italy looked different from those in England. You could not simply pass through borders unnoticed. Your outfit gave you away before you spoke. And then there was the simple problem of practicality. Cloaks snagged on nails, got drenched in rain, and weighed heavily when wet. Hoods restricted vision, making it harder to spot threats. Daggers hidden under clothing bulged awkwardly, leaving lumps that were impossible to explain. Disguise did not help assassins, it sabotaged them. The irony is that legends turn these failures into style. Later art and stories painted assassins as shadowy figures melting into darkness. their cloaks swirling dramatically. The reality was closer to an itchy, lice-infested woolsack that made you sweat, stink and stumble. The hood was not a badge of stealth. It was a medieval neon sign. And as you picture yourself ducking into an alley, cloak soaked, hood scratching, shoes squeaking with the wrong fashion for the wrong street, you realise disguise was never your ally. It was the clumsiest part of your craft, a costume everyone could read like a book. But disguises were only part of the larger challenge. Even when you managed to look the part, you still had to survive the surveillance of medieval taverns, the smoky social centres where information, suspicion, and danger flowed more freely than ale. Taverns were supposed to be safe havens, places where an assassin could blend into the noise and vanish into anonymity. In practice, they were traps where the food poisoned you, the drink emptied your purse, and every stranger's eye lingered on you for too long. An inn or alehouse was less a sanctuary and more a stage, and the assassin who entered one instantly became part of the performance. The smell hit first. Alehouses reeked of stale beer, sweat, smoke, and chamber pots tucked in corners. Chroniclers in England complained that taverns smelled like foul swine houses, where the air grew so thick with smoke that patrons coughed until their eyes watered. For an assassin, trying to plot silently in this environment was impossible. Every cough, every nervous glance, every muttered word carried. You were not hidden. You were simply louder in a room already filled with noise. Food was a gamble you usually lost. Tavern meals were notorious for being stretched with questionable ingredients. Meat pies often included more bone and gristle than flesh. Archaeological analysis of medieval cesspits has revealed animal bones split and boiled to exhaustion, proof that tavern stews were more broth than substance. Bread came hard as stone, dipped in ale to soften it. Ale itself was safer than water, but brewed inconsistently, sometimes sour, sometimes weak, sometimes strong enough to flatten you after a single mug. Assassins who drank too much risked loose tongues. Those who drank too little risked suspicion for not joining in. Either way, you lost. Drunkenness was not cover. It was surveillance. Taverns were where gossip bred, where people dissected every stranger who walked through the door. An assassin in the corner nursing a mug drew more attention than he deflected. Foreign accents carried across the room. Strange clothing was noted. Even the way you paid for ale revealed details about your wealth and status. Surviving tavern accounts in France and England list the names of patrons, showing that innkeepers tracked who came and went. Far from being anonymous, taverns documented you in ledgers you could not escape. Beds in inns were another ordeal. Privacy was rare. Guests shared mattresses stuffed with straw, crawling with fleas, lice, and sometimes rats. Manorial records mention complaints of travellers waking to find coin purses stolen by the very hosts who rented the bed. For assassins, that meant any night's sleep risked not only theft but exposure. Tossing in your sleep revealed weapons, scars, or tattoos better left unseen. One wrong move under a communal blanket and your secret profession was an open question at breakfast. The innkeepers themselves were dangerous. Far from being neutral hosts, they were informants, extortionists, and opportunists. In many cities, tavern owners were legally obligated to report suspicious strangers to authorities. They profited twice, once by taking your coin, and again by selling your name. Court records from Lubeck and Paris mention tavern owners testifying against criminals, often in exchange for immunity. The assassin sitting quietly in the corner might already have been betrayed before the ale cooled in his cup. Drink itself betrayed you. Ale was weaker than modern beer, but wine imported from southern Europe was potent. Wealthier assassins who ordered wine stood out immediately, marked as people with coin to spare. Yet ale carried risks of contamination. Brewing was inconsistent and vats sometimes soured or grew mould. A bad brew meant vomiting in a corner, an event hardly conducive to stealth. Tavern life poisoned you one way or another, with gossip if not with ale. Brawls were a constant hazard. Taverns were notorious for erupting into fights over spilled drinks, insults, or unpaid debts. Local ordinances across Europe include endless attempts to regulate tavern violence. For assassins, a random brawl was catastrophic. Daggers drawn too quickly revealed your trade. Injuries left scars, the kind of identifying marks authorities loved. Surviving rolls of the London courts list endless cases of wounds from tavern brawls, many resulting in arrests or deaths. An assassin trying to disappear often ended up sprawled on a tavern floor, trampled in a fight he never started. Theft was routine. Inns had a reputation for serving guests cheap ale and stealing their purses before morning. Chroniclers tell of innkeepers drugging patrons or hiring prostitutes to distract them while thieves rifled through belongings. For an assassin, every visit risked losing not just coin but weapons, documents or poisons. Imagine waking up in a flea-ridden straw bed only to realise your dagger was gone, likely now in the hands of the city watch who had been tipped off by the innkeeper. And inns outside of towns were worse. Highway inns catered to travellers but also to robbers and mercenaries. Bandits disguised themselves as innkeepers, welcoming guests only to rob or kill them in the night. Tales of murder inns circulated widely enough to terrify travellers, and archaeology occasionally supports the legends. Skeletons found buried in shallow graves near roads suggest that not all travellers survived their lodgings. For an assassin on the run, stopping at such places was less refuge and more Russian roulette. The irony is that taverns were central to medieval social life. People drank, sang, gambled and debated politics within their smoky walls. But for assassins, these lively rooms were minefields. Every eye watched, every ear listened, every ledger recorded. The very place you thought to vanish was the place that ensured you would never be forgotten. And as you picture yourself hunched in the corner of a tavern, ale sour in your mug, fleas biting at your ankles, and the innkeeper already whispering your description to the city watch, you realise inns and taverns did not keep you safe. They kept you visible. But even when you avoided the dangers of alehouses, the road itself was no safer. Travel was slow, treacherous, and filled with perils that made every journey a fresh death sentence. Travel was supposed to expand your opportunities, but for a medieval assassin it was like rolling dice where every side read misery. Roads were not the cobbled highways of Rome anymore. By the late Middle Ages, most were little more than muddy tracks, deeply rutted from cartwheels and constantly flooded after rain. Chroniclers from England complained that wagons sank so deeply that drivers had to abandon them until the ground dried. Walking these roads meant hours of slogging through ankle-deep mud, your boots soaked, your cloak heavy, and your patience gone long before you reached the city gates. Bandits lurked on nearly every route. Royal decrees across Europe constantly mention highwaymen robbing travellers. Some were simple peasants turned desperate during famine years, while others were organised gangs who controlled entire stretches of road. For assassins, who often carried weapons and suspicious amounts of coin, these ambushes were a nightmare. Imagine barely escaping a target alive only to lose everything to a ragged band of farmers with pitchforks. Tolls drained whatever wealth you clung to. Bridges, gates and city entrances all charged fees. Surviving toll registers from Germany list payments for everything from pigs and carts to shoes. Strangers were always charged more. For an assassin, this meant crossing borders ate up your profit before you even arrived. Worse, toll collectors kept records. Your name, accent, or even physical description could be written down. The very act of passing through a checkpoint created evidence that could later tie you to a killing. Travel by horse was faster, but not safer. Horses were expensive to own and dangerous to ride. A single slip on a muddy hill could leave you with a broken leg and a useless animal. Historical veterinary manuals are full of remedies for lame horses, from poultices of herbs to rubbing manure on the hooves. None worked well. For assassins, relying on a horse meant relying on an animal that could betray you with a cough, a limp, or a refusal to cross a bridge. Weather punished you constantly. Rain soaked through cloaks, freezing you at night. Snow blocked passes and trapped travellers for weeks. In summer, heat baked the roads and turned water barrels into breeding grounds for disease. Archaeologists studying medieval skeletons often find evidence of frostbite, heat stress, and chronic arthritis, proof of how harsh the elements were. Assassins faced all this while trying to maintain secrecy. You could not skulk in shadows when you were too busy sneezing or sunburned to the point of glowing. Inns along the way were unreliable and many were outright traps. Chronicles tell of travellers murdered by innkeepers who robbed their guests. Excavations near ancient roads have uncovered shallow graves, supporting the tales of murder inns. Even the honest ones charged outrageous fees, forcing travellers into crowded barns where strangers shared straw beds. For assassins, sleeping next to merchants and pilgrims meant risking exposure every time you rolled over. Crossing borders was worse. Each territory had its own customs, accents, and clothing. A stranger stood out immediately. City guards questioned travellers, demanding stories of where they came from and why. With no passports, you relied on charm and luck. Fail to convince a suspicious bailiff, and you might end up jailed for being a vagabond. Vagabonds were often whipped, branded, or expelled, punishments that made anonymity impossible. Assassins lived in fear of questions because the answers were never good enough. Rivers added another obstacle. Ferries carried passengers across, but they were slow, overcrowded, and unsafe. Drownings were common. Chroniclers describe overloaded boats capsizing, sending dozens into icy water. If you tried to swim, heavy clothing dragged you under. Archaeological finds of ferry remains show crude construction, little more than rafts with planks nailed down. Crossing a river was gambling with your life, and losing meant floating downstream. A corpse no one mistook for an accident. Even your stomach turned against you on the road. Travellers carried bread, cheese, and dried meat, but spoilage came fast. Worms infested flour, maggots filled cheese, and dried meat often stank before the journey ended. Food poisoning was common. A sick assassin retching into a ditch was an easy mark for bandits or guards. Chronic illness from bad food appears in countless accounts, a reminder that hunger was never solved by simply packing supplies. The irony was that the safest way to travel was in large groups, like pilgrimages or merchant caravans. But assassins thrived on secrecy, not crowds. Joining a pilgrimage meant walking for weeks surrounded by priests, merchants, and gossiping villagers, all of whom remembered your face. Staying alone meant exposure to bandits and hunger. Either choice was a disaster. And so the road itself became one more enemy. Every step was muddy, expensive, or dangerous. Every river, bridge, and inn was another trap. Travel did not broaden horizons for assassins. It narrowed them, closing in with every toll, every watchman, every slip in the mud. And as you picture yourself limping down a rutted track, soaked, hungry, and clutching coins already clipped by toll collectors, you realise that survival on the road was not about skill or stealth. It was about luck, and luck was a currency assassins rarely had. But even if you reached your destination alive, there was still the endless problem of communication. Letters, codes, and messages often betrayed assassins faster than swords, turning words themselves into lethal traps. Killing in silence was one thing, but arranging the job in the first place meant leaving a trail of words, and in the Middle Ages words could betray you more fatally than blades. Letters were fragile, codes were clumsy, and messengers had a habit of opening the very messages they carried. An assassin's deadliest leak was not blood, it was ink. Writing itself was uncommon. Only a small percentage of the population could read or write, usually clerics, not killers. This meant assassins rarely wrote their own instructions. They relied on scribes, who were about as discreet as a rooster in a cathedral. Picture paying a local scribe to pen your shopping list. Only it says stab the count at midnight. The scribe might copy the letter for practice, or worse, tell the priest. The illusion of secrecy dissolved the moment ink touched parchment, and parchment was expensive. Vellum made from calf skin cost dearly. Cheap parchment was rough, obvious, and rarely burned cleanly when you tried to destroy it. Fragments lingered in hearths, charred but legible. Archaeologists have found scorched scraps of medieval documents in waste pits, evidence that secrets did not vanish as easily as their authors hoped. For an assassin, every half-burned contract was a time bomb waiting for the wrong eyes. Seals were supposed to protect letters. Nobles pressed wax with unique stamps, ensuring authenticity. But seals were easily broken and replaced. Wax softened with warm fingers or steam peeled away, allowing curious messengers to peek. Recipes for resealing letters appear in household guides, proof the practice was common. Even a nosy tavern boy could crack open your pay order, read about the upcoming murder, and sell the knowledge to the authorities before you finished your ale. Codes were clumsier still. Cipher systems in the Middle Ages were primitive, often simple substitutions or symbol swaps. A circle for an A, a triangle for a B. Amusing for amateurs, useless against any monk with time on his hands. Monastic scriptoria doubled as intelligence hubs, with clerics trained to recognize patterns. Surviving letters from Italian city-states show entire codes cracked with ease, the secrets laid bare like spilled wine. An assassin trusting a code might as well have drawn a map for his own execution. Messengers themselves were hazards. Many were boys or hired riders, paid in coins too small to buy silence. Theft of letters was routine. Chroniclers describe messengers robbed on roads, their letters sold to rivals. Some messengers simply read the documents themselves, then demanded bribes to keep quiet. Inquisitorial records include cases where assassins were exposed because the courier turned informant. Words travelled farther than feet, and they carried betrayal with them. Even spoken communication carried danger. Taverns, markets, and churches buzzed with conversations overheard by the wrong ears. Dialects betrayed you instantly. A French assassin pretending to be Flemish stumbled over pronunciation. An English killer in York revealed himself with a London accent. Linguistic studies of medieval records show strong regional distinctions. People noticed outsiders. Words exposed you before you ever reached your blade. And then there was rumour itself. A whispered message could spread like plague. One noble hinting that an assassination was planned quickly became half the city repeating it. Without newspapers, gossip served as medieval media. It warped truth into stories that doomed assassins long before any strike. By the time you approached your target, your name might already be whispered in kitchens and churchyards. The church weaponized communication too. Sermons denounced secret killers in public, sometimes naming suspects outright. Priests thundered against those who strike in shadows, drawing suspicious eyes toward anyone who looked nervous. Assassins could not silence sermons, and they echoed louder than any whispered bribe. The pulpit was the loudest communication network of the age, and it always spoke against you. Contracts themselves were double-edged. Employers wanted written proof to ensure loyalty, but those same documents became evidence. Surviving medieval court cases sometimes reference agreements for services rendered that were thinly veiled assassination orders. Once captured, assassins had their papers read aloud in trials, damning them further. Literacy, once a tool of power, became a trap for the illiterate killers who trusted it. Even when you avoided letters, tokens betrayed you. Payment was sometimes promised through objects: a ring, a knife, a marked coin. These tokens, meant to guarantee authenticity, were easily lost or stolen. Archaeologists have unearthed rings with insignia still recognizable centuries later, tokens that might once have condemned their owners. Imagine being dragged before a judge while a farmer waves your employer's ring, claiming he found it in the mud where you stumbled. The irony is that communication, the very thing meant to secure your work, nearly always secured your downfall instead. You could be silent with your blade, but the world was not silent around you. Letters, whispers, sermons, and gossip travelled faster than you could run. And as you picture yourself watching a messenger ride off with your coded instructions, praying he does not sell them at the next market, you realise words are sharper than any weapon you own. They cut directly to your guilt. leaving you defenseless long before the dagger leaves its sheath. But communication was only one kind of exposure. Even your hiding places betrayed you, because medieval cities offered few shadows deep enough to cover a killer. Your supposed bolt holes were more like traps, filled with rats, filth, and watchful neighbours. If you wanted to vanish in the Middle Ages, your options were bleak. The idea of a secret hideout, a shadowy bolt hole where an assassin could rest unseen, was largely fantasy. What you actually got was a rat-infested corner of a tannery, or a damp cellar so mouldy it coughed up spores with every breath. In theory, the assassin was a ghost. In reality, he was a man sitting in sewage trying not to sneeze. Medieval cities did not have many shadows deep enough to hide in. Streets were narrow, yes, but also crowded. A city like London in the 14th century had upwards of 80,000 people, squeezed into tight quarters, and they noticed everything. A stranger lurking near a well was suspicious. A stranger lurking in the same spot 2 nights in a row was doomed. Town watchmen were not the only danger. Neighbours were nosier than any constable, reporting anything that smelled unusual, looked unusual, or twitched in the dark. That meant you. The classic assassin hideout, the cellar, was an obvious choice only because it was so miserable no one else wanted it. These basements, often dug directly into clay or stone filled with water after rains. Archaeological digs in York and Ghent have uncovered medieval cellars with drainage ditches clogged by centuries of silt. Imagine huddling there while dampness crept into your bones and every sound echoed like a trumpet. Worse still, cellars were not private. Families stored food, merchants stored goods, and rats stored themselves everywhere. You were never alone. Then there were taverns, which seem cinematic as hiding spots until you remember how medieval taverns actually worked. They were smoky, loud, and full of suspicious regulars who knew every face. Alehouses were hubs of gossip, and nothing spread faster than the story of a mysterious man renting the loft. Many town ordinances required innkeepers to keep lists of guests, precisely because kings and bishops feared conspirators. Surviving regulations from 14th century Paris show that innkeepers could be fined if they failed to report strangers. Your bolt hole was effectively a guest book for your own capture. Even rural hiding places were disasters. Forests were not silent havens but carefully watched resources. Lords claimed rights over game, wood and pasture, and forest law was enforced brutally. Hide in Sherwood, and foresters noted every footprint. The English crown kept entire rolls of assart fines, fees charged for illegal encroachment into forests. That meant if you tried to camp there, someone either noticed or fined you. Solitude was expensive. Monasteries might seem like safer ground. Cloisters were quiet, monks wrote all day, and the stone walls looked impenetrable. But monasteries were also some of the most surveilled spaces in Europe. Everyone in a monastery knew everyone else, and strangers stuck out like boils on a relic. The rule of St. Benedict required discipline and order. That meant bell towers rang constantly, monks moved in strict routines, and nothing went unnoticed. Hide in a cloister too long, and you became the suspicious outsider disrupting God's schedule. There were underground passages, yes, but they were less romantic tunnels and more elongated latrines. Archaeological studies in Lübeck and Prague have mapped medieval drainage channels used as hiding places during wars. These were damp, waist-deep in filth, and often led directly to cesspits. If the stench did not suffocate you, the gases might. Methane accumulation in medieval privies was no joke, with chroniclers even describing explosions when torches were carried inside. So much for dramatic subterranean retreats. Even rooftops, occasionally imagined as assassin perches, were traps in their own right. Medieval roofs were mostly thatch, vulnerable to fire and collapse. Climbing them risked breaking through and dropping directly into someone's home. Surviving coroners' rolls from 13th century London list accidental deaths from roof falls, often involving thieves. In essence, perching on a medieval roof made you more visible, more fragile, and often more laughable than hidden. And then there was hunger. Bolt holes offered shelter, not sustenance. Staying hidden for long meant sneaking out at night for food, which defeated the point. Markets were noisy in the day, but dead quiet at night. A single loaf of bread bought after dark could give you away. Records from medieval courts often show thieves caught because they prowled bakeries after curfew. Assassins suffered the same hunger pangs, forced to risk discovery for a stale crust. Some turned to cemeteries, which were technically public and full of shadows. But cemeteries were busy places in the Middle Ages, not abandoned gardens of stone. Parish churches held services daily. Graveyards were used for markets and fairs, and people wandered among the tombs constantly. Archaeologists studying churchyards in England have found evidence of heavy foot traffic, compacted earth worn down by shoes. Hiding among gravestones was like hiding in the town square, only with worse symbolism. The irony was that every supposed bolt hole worked against you. Cities teemed with watchful eyes, rural spaces belonged to lords, monasteries buzzed with rules, and underground hideouts suffocated their occupants. Even the rats had better options. Every corner of medieval life was public in ways we struggle to imagine today. Privacy barely existed. To disappear was to draw attention, because vanishing itself was suspicious. That meant an assassin spent as much time running from his own supposed shelters as he did from his enemies. Hiding was never safe. It was only a temporary pause in discomfort, another way for filth, hunger, or gossip to gnaw away at you. By the time you emerged from a bolt hole, pale, coughing, and half-starved, you looked exactly like the criminal the town crier had warned everyone about. And just as your supposed hiding places betrayed you, so too did the clothes on your back. Disguise was less about becoming invisible, and more about announcing yourself as suspicious, because medieval fashion revealed far more than it concealed. Blending in was supposed to be the assassin's art, but medieval fashion turned it into a death sentence. Clothing in the Middle Ages was not just fabric. It was a loud, unmissable badge announcing where you came from, what you did, and how much you were worth. Archaeologists studying wool dyes from digs in London and Lubeck have shown that even subtle colours mark status. Bright red screamed wealth, faded brown whispered poverty, and the wrong shade in the wrong parish could earn you more suspicion than carrying a knife. Every town had its own style. Shoemakers cut shoes with different points, hats were stitched differently, and guilds regulated who could wear what. In Florence, sumptuary laws dictated the fabrics allowed by class, with fines for wearing silks above your station. In England, a 1363 law restricted furs and velvets to nobles. If you tried to disguise yourself as a commoner when you were not, the cloth alone betrayed you. If you tried to dress as a noble, the law punished you with confiscation, fines, or worse. Either way, blending in meant standing out. Beards and hair did not help. Styles varied wildly by region, and people remembered faces in smaller communities. Medieval chroniclers often described criminals by distinctive hairstyles. The Norman tonsure, the German bowl cut, the English fringe, all broadcasted where you belonged. Cutting your hair too crudely could mark you as a runaway serf, which itself was a punishable crime. Worse still, attempts at disguise made you look like a walking crime scene. Contemporary records from French courts showed dozens of criminals caught not because they were recognised, but because they were recognised as trying not to be recognised. Masks were no better. Paper or cloth masks were associated with festivals, charivaries, and misrule. To wear one outside of carnival was to scream criminality. Venetian masks may have become fashionable later, but in the Middle Ages they were a rare curiosity, not a standard disguise. Cover your face in Paris in 1350, and you would be dragged to the nearest watchman for questioning. Cover your face in London, and you risked being mistaken for someone with the plague. Either way, the disguise was not convincing. And then there was the smell. People often forget that disguise required more than clothing. It required masking scent. A nobleman stank of musk and rose oil. A peasant reeked of smoke and sweat, and these odours carried far. In a world without regular baths, your body's story was as revealing as your accent. Chroniclers describe how refugees and beggars could be identified simply by the smell they brought into a room. No amount of wool or leather could erase the truth in your pores. Even speech was a problem. Dialects shifted every few miles. In medieval England alone, a traveller from Norfolk sounded nothing like a man from Kent. If you spoke the wrong vowel, you were exposed. The peasants' revolt of 1381 even used dialect as a weapon. Rebels demanded travellers say bread and cheese to prove they were locals, since outsiders pronounced it differently. Imagine being an assassin, cloaked in the perfect disguise, only to be undone by ordering supper in the wrong accent. The church also worked against you. Religious clothing was tightly controlled, and pretending to be a monk or nun was both heresy and a crime. Monastic records from the 13th century note severe penalties for impersonating clerics. A false tonsure could land you before an ecclesiastical court, where the punishment ranged from public flogging to excommunication. Dressing as a pilgrim might have seemed safer, but pilgrimage itself required documents and tokens purchased at shrines. If you carried the wrong badge, or if it was obvious you had not actually walked the journey, you were treated as a fraud. Even footwear was a liability. The infamous poulain, those long pointed shoes popular in the 14th century, varied by length depending on class. Nobles could wear exaggerated points, peasants shorter ones. If you wore the wrong shoe, you could be fined. Disguise was literally policed by the length of your toes. Archaeological finds in London show these shoes were so distinctive that even fragments reveal the wearer's status. Try sneaking around in the wrong pair and you announced yourself with every step. And then there were scars. The Middle Ages loved to catalogue scars. Court records from York and Paris describe criminals with scars on their hands, faces or arms, often from earlier punishments like branding or whipping. These were impossible to hide. A branded hand betrayed you instantly, no matter the cloak. Disguise was futile against a legal system obsessed with visible proof of sin. In short, disguise in the Middle Ages was a parody of invisibility. Every cloth, every stitch, every vowel, every odour turned you into an exhibit. The assassin who tried to vanish ended up catalogued by the very culture he sought to evade. He was not a ghost. He was a badly dressed stranger with the wrong shoes, the wrong hair and the wrong vowels, sweating under everyone's gaze. And as humiliating as it was to try and hide in plain sight, what really shredded the assassin's nerves was travel itself. Roads were not corridors of freedom. They were corridors of scrutiny, tolls, and endless questions about who you were and why you were there. And that's where we'll leave our poor medieval assassin for tonight, fumbling through disguises that fooled absolutely no one, and probably smelling like a dying goat in the process. If you enjoyed this little dive into historical misery, do me a favour, drop a comment and let me know what video you'd like me to suffer through next. And if you can't get enough of history's most ridiculous tortures, humiliations and bad life choices, go check out my other videos. They're full of the kind of suffering that makes you grateful for modern plumbing, deodorant and Netflix.